Start. So welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join our virtual Thank you for joining our virtual town hall today. The theme of the town hall session today is creating workspaces for human happiness. And I'll shortly introduce our guest speaking, Dr. Gemma John. But in terms of format, it's a 45-minute session, a short session. And once I've introduced Gemma, she'll just kind of talk to us for 15, 20 minutes, share some of her thoughts around the topic of creating workspaces for human happiness. And then we'll move into Q&A. So Q&A, we can do by raising hands, we can do it by typing questions into the chat bar as we go. But obviously we'll try and get plenty of time for some open discussion, interaction in a short while. Can I also ask, final thing before I do the intro, is just if you could be on mute if not speaking. We've also got quite a lot on today's call, so it'd be really useful if you can stay on mute unless you're actually talking through the session. So let me move to introduce Gemma, Dr. Gemma John. Gemma, welcome. Very much appreciate you joining today's session, sharing some of your thoughts with us. Gemma is the founder of Human City and leads a team that uses human insight and business intelligence to help create inclusive and sustainable value propositions, create new market opportunities and deliver social benefits through the design and management of real estate assets. She's an applied anthropologist and therefore she studies cultural shifts and the changing ways in which people live and work in the urban environments. And she starts, I'm told, with the question, what does it mean to be human? But really looks at how kind of real estate could respond to shifting priorities to create new places and experiences that consider technological, environmental and societal challenges. I think also, Gemma, you'll struggle to get away today without talking about the impact of the pandemic. So I look forward to discussing that element as well. But without further ado, Gemma, thank you, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I think Alice is going to bring up some slides. Great. Are we all set?
We can all see the slides, so you're good to go, Gemma.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. So lovely to be here. Yeah, as your previous speaker, Kirk Vallis, mentioned, I'm hopefully bringing a different perspective to this discussion around the future of work, workplace, human happiness, to spark conversation and debate. But we very much consider you as the experts. You're working in this field and trying to bring about change and find solutions. So really, I value your feedback and also really looking forward to the discussion after this presentation so we can exchange views on what next for the workplace. So how does, still same slide, I'll say next slide if we're going through. So how has the pandemic changed the relationship between people, workplaces and cities? Or putting it differently, how do we create workplaces for human happiness? And just to give you a sense of how we're thinking about this, we ran a survey at the end of last year and surveyed people in the UK, and overwhelmingly 76% of respondents agreed positively, strongly agree or somewhat agree with the statement that quality of life has become more important than their job. You know, so that leaves us with a question of around, you know, if people are prioritising the quality of their lives, you know, how can we as workplaces really design spaces and meet their priorities to ensure that employees do have a quality of life and there is a balance between those two. And actually, the group 16 to 24-year-olds, the figure rose to 81%. So actually, of all the respondents, that group, the Gen Z cohort, is specifically focusing on quality of life. Next slide. So how do businesses use their real estate to satisfy the evolving needs of staff while maximising productivity, generating high quality and efficient outputs? Well, the tough question. And it's been a long-standing one for workplace consultants, and many say COVID-19 has accelerated many workplace trends that are already in play. So back in 2004, DGW came up with these 4 workplace types, these settings: co-work, open house, working commons and cohabit. And they really described how these settings were used in the context of work. So actually the workplace is the city. So actually providing these different functions in the workplace, but also the city is the workplace, the city as the workplace. So actually how do you, these functions can be found across different city locations. But the pandemic's done more than this. It's not just accelerated existing trends and created new spatial challenges, but actually it's raised questions around social life and behaviour. So actually it's not just a question around where we work, but it's also how we work and what suits us as individuals. And so many of the techniques we use to get work done will change, from the way we manage our teams, to the way we communicate with and incentivise staff, to how we measure and assess productivity. All of that's going to, I think, change. And most importantly, new centres will be revolve around home. Previously solutions would have been very much about work and life in the city, and now actually solutions that are coming forward are revolving around home. And the pandemic has refocused our attention to home life. It's not just a distance from home, it's rather distance of work from home that's the key measure. So rather than thinking about proximity to home and suburbs, we're actually thinking about which is a fundamental shift in our thinking about work. Next slide. So to attract and retain top talent, we're in an increasingly varied landscape with an increased number of options for employees and obviously for occupiers and companies. And we need to start with the end user to establish what the next step should look like and should be. We need to consider what makes people happy, human happiness. And there are common dimensions to happiness: belonging, empowerment, appreciation, purposeful, and to be respected. And when people are happy, they improve their performance. So they work harder at work, they stay for longer, there's less churn and reduced costs. But also businesses improve their reputations. Actually, people, employees talk positively about businesses. So actually businesses receive positive reviews and attract top talent. So it's a nice virtuous circle. Employees are more productive, and an extensive study into happiness by Oxford University, Oxford Saïd Business School, said that happiness and productivity are intrinsically linked. Workers are 13% more productive when they are happy. So happiness is going to be a key differentiator as we emerge from COVID-19 and into a new way of working. But how do we measure happiness? And what are the factors that affect it? Some things aren't within our control. So, for example, the Oxford study suggested that weather, affects our happiness. Now, not many of us can do anything about the weather, but there are some things within our control. And as standard chartered to suggest, we actually can begin to think about learning from our employees to understand what happiness means to them, and then adjust our workplace and workplace conditions accordingly. So actually letting employees themselves show us what benefits them and how they make themselves happier, and then learning off the back of that. So measurement will involve a triangulation of three types of data gathered through employee surveys, existing data sets within the corporation, and so forth. Measuring behaviours, how people get work done. So what are they doing at home? What are they doing in various environments in order to get work done? Measuring employee sentiment, how do they actually feel about work? In the concept of work, in the context of how they're getting work done, how they feel about work. And thirdly, measuring business outcomes. So actually, how's the business itself performing? And triangulating those three data sets will allow you to begin to learn how employees' behaviour is being adjusted, how they feel about work, and then how that's leading to business productivity as a whole. Next slide. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about three main aspects: so people and society, real estate, and the future of cities. Just to touch on these three very briefly before I go into them. People in society, people's needs differ. People feel differently about incorporating the work and their work into their homescape. So we need to understand how people differ and what they want. Second of all, real estate. Every company is putting forward a different proposition that's reflective of their culture and the type of staff they have and the demographic of their staff. And we've heard many of these examples now recently in the press, from Goldman Sachs to Spotify. Future of cities. Cities and towns themselves are changing. We know that the high street is in trouble, and we know that regeneration is taking place across different cities. And so different cities and towns will offer up different solutions and different opportunities for integrating work into that homescape that's being imagined. And we know in the context of cities that there's been a shift away from sprawl towards densification, pedestrianisation, urban agriculture. And there's a preference to have shorter supply chains, production near consumption, local workforces, and consumers living near their work. So, things are changing. Next slide. So let's start with people and society. I'm going to dwell a little bit on this because this is what anthropologists tend to do, is focus on people and culture. So what are the new expectations of the workplace across genders and generations? So let's start with women. I think we've heard lots of stories about women and women's experiences of work in the last few months. A lot of the academic literature tells us that a lot of women find a different kind of identity at work. So actually working allows them to express themselves in a different way, away from home. But we've also heard that in the home context that women are carrying the burden both of work and of their home life. So they're having to juggle both of those dynamics. And online technology is not helping. It's actually extending our work hours. So there's a sense of presumption of increased productivity because we have more hours to play with because we're all connected. But actually that's producing stress and anxiety. So how can companies help alleviate that anxiety in this new workscape or working in a homescape? So the hybrid solution is essential for people like women to escape from the home environment and make a distinct separation from home life and work life, I would suggest. Young people, they're going to be most affected by the pandemic. Gen Z, so that's 16 to 24-year-olds, are now very values driven. We all know they're purpose led. They are much more inclined to invest in ethical brands. And actually the organisation, the culture of an organisation will really be important to them, and they'll want to identify with that quite clearly. And so identification for them will be about going to work. It will be about going to a corporate office somewhere that they can be proud of. So younger people will both, more comfortable with remote working, but also be inclined to want to visit the office and use the office as a kind of a sense of as part of a sense of pride. Baby boomers. So health and well-being has affected the health and well-being of baby boomers is the greatest concern for employees, particularly in a pandemic. Actually, but also we know that in this pandemic that many of them have had cause to retire, so that actually the makeup of the workforce is less intergenerational than perhaps it was before the pandemic. So we're now in a situation where we've had a shift in character of the workplace, and what the prime benefits of working in an intergenerational workplace was that learning, that peer learning engagement that took place between generations, which has been and will be to somewhat lost. So how can companies fill that gap in peer learning across generations? Next slide. So this is just again thinking about real estate opportunities and this spectrum that we're all now going to be dealing with. So we're going to be thinking about obviously work in the context of an office, but also work in the context of home. But there are new solutions being brought forward as well. A standard charter, I've mentioned this already, has proposed it has three kinds of spaces. It has offers up home as a workplace, the office, but also near me. And we all are becoming familiar with that near me solution, which is a flexible workplace near to where people might live. And so I've suggested that these different groups, so women, Gen Z and seniors, will end up potentially preferring different options here. And so therefore you might get individuals in different locations at different times based on their particular preferences. The future of the corporate office, we've also heard that the corporate office will have to become much more collegiate and flexible. And we're not talking about flexibility in terms of space optimization. We're talking about flexibility in terms of reuse of space over time. So we might find that teams use the same space over the course of the week. Near me offices, well, where are they going to be based? There's the talk of walkability. So actually the importance of the near me office is actually people can walk to it, and actually also be near transport nodes so that people then can travel into the office if they need to. So there's discussion in the context of London of having near me offices, you know, some companies positioning their near me offices around the M25. And so as we look forward into the future, there are opportunities for companies to further integrate into local communities in the context of near me. The near me office will be more local with potential for mixed use and multi-use spaces. And of course, there's a question of sustainability and carbon footprint and contribution to local communities. Next slide. So, I mean, we've talked about hub and spoke for some time. Actually, we might find it's more of a networked model where some of these new opportunities for locating in and providing different kinds of workspaces will end up dovetailing with new ideas of the city and city making. So in the context of London and elsewhere, there's obviously been discussion around the 15-minute city, the 1-minute city, and a more effective utilisation of local spaces and localisation of economies. We've heard about the failure or the decline of footfall in the high street, and we have potential to see near me workspaces over the top of shops in underutilised high streets. We've got the potential to think about regeneration spaces, including innovation hubs and business centres, maker spaces that has an element of co-working to them for lifelong membership, learning and potential membership. And also multi-use spaces. So we're beginning to see much more inner city co-living and new transport hubs being offered up in the context of regeneration that themselves might overlap with workplaces. Next slide. So this is my final slide. So when considering all this, we need to think about the ecosystem, and this is where your guys' expertise comes in. It's not just about the space, it's about the experience. So companies will have to completely consider their values and think about how their values come across in the design of their spaces and the experiences they provide for their workforce. There's going to be a race to quality, a race to providing quality spaces and quality experiences, and collaborative work areas and more activation of the spaces that are provided in order to provide the right kind of experience. So some summary points, 3 summary points. Focusing on recruitment, companies have to think seriously about what they're offering their employees. So historically, pre-pandemic, we would have offered employees benefits that allow them to juggle home life in the context of work. Now we're thinking about how employees can juggle work life in the context of home. So how will recruitment incentives differ? You know, it might be that there is a subscription to a local business centre. It might be that actually a company decides it wants to provide employees with tokens so they can invest in their local community. Who knows? But I think things need to be thought about differently. Technology. So I mentioned culture here, but I think technology is going to be a key part of the culture of an organisation, and it will help shape and reinforce workplace culture. So companies have to consider how corporate and brand culture will be communicated and reinforced. And companies are beginning to consider technologies like VR in order to do that. And finally, productivity. This is at the back of all of our minds. So how does this all affect productivity? Well, companies will have to rethink productivity rather than around hours, because workplace hours are potentially going to be extended as a result of the technology that's on offer to us, but much more firmly set around outcomes. So how can we think about productivity in terms of outcomes which incorporate both financial and health metrics? Thank you.
Gemma, thank you. I think some very thought-provoking insights there. I think as a bunch of real estate professionals, lots to think about there in the context of how we do sort of change the workplace to make our people both happy but also more productive. I'm going to kick the questions off in a minute, but obviously the intention is that any of you can raise questions. So by raising your hand in the kind of the Teams function at the top there, or by typing a question into the chat bar, we'll hopefully get some dialogue going. But if I can perhaps kick off, Chairman. You talked a number of times there about how the whole concept, I guess, of workspace in the traditional sense in the office. Clearly, that's through the pandemic period has been in forced change. It's now perhaps becoming kind of more of the norm. We see a shift away from having just that physical office space to the near space, to the home space, etc. How do you think that's going to change the whole, I guess, remit, responsibilities, duty of care, relationship, if you like, between the employer and the employee as kind of that concept of where people work and how they work starts to change?
Yeah, great. Good question. I know models of management are beginning to shift already. So, I mean, I did a little bit of reading around architecture practices and how they're having to think much more around models of autonomy. So, you know, in terms of responsibility, people coming forward and having more of an autonomous role with their peers. So that's, and of course, it's difficult to manage from afar virtually when you can't necessarily see what people are doing and how they're doing it. So there's got to be an element of trust in there as well. But yeah, it will have to be reconsidered, and I think that has to be done on a team by team basis, a company by company basis. I think companies themselves will know what is best for them in the context of the work that they try and deliver. But I think these changes aren't necessarily new. I think some companies that were already thinking about reorganizing teams based on user experience. So actually, you know, the end user of a product and how to reorganize their teams much more in a kind of mixed way. So they kind of incorporated different elements of different teams in a kind of more of a combination of skills that would help deliver a particular product that delivered for the end user. So I don't think it's new to think about teams and how they get restructured, but I think potentially that might be part of what gets considered in the next steps.
Okay, thank you. No hands up yet, so I'll keep going the questions, but it would be great if we have some questions on the floor. I'll ask one question, I'll bring Nadia in to kind of move on. But it's just explore a little bit more, if you can, or expand, Gemma, on that trust point. There's been a lot of talk about trust and to what extent employers will trust their employees to work in a completely autonomous, flexible way. Do you think that we'll kind of see a kind of a pulling back from the big, bold commitments made by the likes of Twitter that you can work anywhere you like, and we'll find a balance in the middle? Or do you think that trust that we've had to put in our people as employers in the past year or so will become much more the norm?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it, trust? So, I mean, where I see trust really being part of how the employer relationship is where organizations are purpose-led, and actually people are buying into what the organization is trying to deliver. So that will increasingly be a consideration for companies coming out of COVID. I think purpose and values is something that companies will have to reflect on quite seriously. Many of them already do, but I think they'll have to make those much more explicit in order to sway consumers that actually, and or employees that their companies the right one to align with. And I think if you get that in place, that and you get employees to buy into what the company itself is trying to achieve, and of course how that filters through various decision-making channels, I think it's probably easier to build trust because people are buying into what you're trying to do and achieve as an organization.
Thank you, Jen. Right, so I think actually Nadia first, and we'll come to Frank. But Nadia, question from you.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Gemma. I think it's been fascinating listening to it. One of the points that I find really interesting is the idea of the loss of the multi-generational learning. I think it was one of the things I read fairly early on during the pandemic when people started talking about remote working was certainly for the younger generations, how do we have that peer learning going on when we're in a remote working situation? And I think for a lot of us who are slightly older, you almost forget how much you learned from those around you. And given that a lot of decision makers are going to be in that older age category, how do we engage and educate those people so they understand how to bring that into the remote working landscape?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I mean, the loss of knowledge that comes with early retirement is probably just, it's quite significant. And it's I back in the day when I was working in financial services in London, it was a problem back then in terms of how do you retain that knowledge, and keep it in the organisation while allowing, employees obviously to move on and retire. So clever ways of somehow keeping relationships going, even though the people aren't formally part of an organization, that actually there's still a kind of a framework that allow people to maybe mentor each other on a kind of informal basis. A few years ago, it was about, banking knowledge and keeping and having some kind of management plan, so information is maintained and organized in a kind of much more accessible way, so people can, in a sense, upload and download their knowledge. But I would suggest actually, networks and mentoring programs and ensuring there's a kind of wide reach across and beyond your organization through alumni, etc., is probably the way, better way to take it.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Gemma. Frederick, I think, next, your question.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So Gemma, well, first of all, thanks a lot for organizing this session. It's very interesting and very hot in terms of a topic also with us. So I work for Shell in real estate, and my team is delivering workplaces across the EMEA region. Now, if I look at the world before COVID, then a lot of our focus was indeed on experience and to some extent happiness. And I think we actually were driving in the right direction in that respect. But then COVID hits in, and now we're trying to think about the post-COVID world. We have a lot of in-flight projects, and we're trying to figure it out in terms of what we should offer to be successful and to basically deliver workplaces into the future that allow people to continue to perform at their best. And I like the way you spoke about flexibility and choice. And those are sort of key words that we try to get our heads around, because, people likely will have a need to have a wider degree of choice where to work from. Is it the home, the office, one of the spokes, maybe a bar? Choice in the workplace setup. So it could be a formal desk or collaborative space. And also ways of working we see changing. So my question is, with so much change and so many question marks around what the world looks like moving forward, diversity of people, ways of working changing, is there any tips, best practices that you see clients, corporates around you in terms of how they deal with that? Because from a real estate footprint perspective, we of course have to optimize. We can't just bring in more square meters constantly to offer all kinds of variety of workplaces, choice, etc. So what tips, best practices do you see to provide an optimized footprint, but still allowing people to have that choice and flexibility that people are looking for? Huh?
Yeah, I think, look, data is going to be your best friend. So I think, you'll know this, that actually it's collecting data from occupiers around, how people are using their spaces, and using that data to then inform your workplace strategy and real estate strategy. But at the moment, we don't necessarily have the data. The data's still emerging. So I think that's the tricky bit. Actually, we'll want to move faster than we're able to because we just don't have the data to act on. But I think quite quickly, post-pandemic, you'll see that the data will begin to create patterns of meaning, so you can learn and interpret that much more usefully. I mean, in London, I think you've all yet to get back to the office. Elsewhere, and people have already gone back to the office. So actually, is there data that can be mined from other countries where actually there's been a kind of a revisitation of the idea of the office and the future of the office? The other point is different companies are doing it differently. So it really depends on your occupier and their particular culture they want to create. I mean, as we know, Goldman Sachs is enforcing this rule that everyone goes back to the office, and that might work for them. But I think companies are going to increasingly differentiate themselves by using their real estate differently. And that will be something you will have to factor in, and obviously it's a kind of it's a push-pull. So you will attract certain occupiers based on the spaces you provide, and vice versa. You provide spaces based on your occupiers.
Yeah, no, well said. So yes, we're applying that from a strategic lens in our workplace program, but also on the commercial side, we bring more flexibility in our leases, so we can scale as we see fit. So that makes sense. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Frederick. And a few more questions. We've got a couple of questions on the chat bar as well. But I think Lax, you had your hand. Your question.
Thank you, Neil. Right. So I think the question is for Gemma. Right. So, initially after the pandemic, sometime through April through June, there was a lot of chatter about this place near me, work from anywhere concept. Right. But now, like most firms, we're evolving our thinking about the future of work. And long term, to your point about the multi-generational learning, mentorship, and there's a reason why colleagues go into hub locations to work, like New York, right? Because people come from Connecticut, Long Island, South Jersey, North Jersey, And that's very difficult to achieve when you start creating these satellite serviced offices close to where people live, right? So I think we're sort of pulling back from our thinking about work from anywhere. And we're saying, absolutely, I think our office will be the center of gravity. People will come into the office to work, but a bit more flexibly. But we don't think this number of satellite offices close to where people live is going to be a major part of a solution. That's our current thinking. I just wanted to get your views on that, Gemma.
Yeah, and that's perfectly acceptable as a way forward. I think, you know, increasingly we're going to see that diversity. I think different companies will create different solutions for them that work based on the nature of their work, and we'll see that as part of their offering to employees, you know, in attracting and retaining staff. It might shift and change over time as you kind of decide that different solutions work for you much more better. But it's yeah, this is an experiment, isn't it? It's a live experiment, and it's about establishing what works. I mean, if you're offering flexibility, then it's a question for you as to what the future of the home will look like. You know, ultimately, what kind of homes people will need in order to do what they do. I mean, until now, we've been having meetings in our cars because not everyone has a spare room. Not everyone can get that quiet time away from their kids. So, yeah, it's about what how you can help your employees work both at home and obviously in the context of your office.
Thank you.
Max, thank you. Just to take a question off the chat, as the next question will come to some of the people with hands up. Gemma, I think to paraphrase James Dunn's question, there's obviously a lot of forward thinking, clearly there's been some enforced change, but I guess the kind of short question is really how do we avoid eroding all the positivity, the positive movements, the changes we have start to make, so we don't just go back to the way we used to do it before the pandemic?
Indeed. I think. Look, I don't think we will. I think even if companies want to go back, I think already, as I said from the outset with that survey statistic, you know, people themselves have chosen quality of life over their jobs. So that throws into question. Actually, people are willing to sacrifice work and a kind of secure employment temporarily for a better life. And I'm hearing anecdotally, particularly women are beginning to think seriously about the time they spend at work and whether they could spend their time fruitfully on other things, or whether there's more of a compromise that can be reached. So I think moving forward, I don't think it can be ignored. I think people will begin to make decisions and opt out or opt into organisations that do meet their specific needs around quality of life and balance between work and life.
Thank you. Thanks, Gemma. James O'Neill, your question, please.
Hey, sorry. James O'Neill, so global head of workspace for Unit 4. We're a cloud tech company, and last year we introduced a flexible working program. So we actually gave every single employee the choice to choose where they are most comfortable, right, office or home. So we've actually kind of move forward with that, and you know, just picking up on that trust element you were talking about, and to Lac's point, one of the things that we kind of moved away from very quickly was the slogan work from anywhere, because we had people kind of pinging us saying, oh, does this mean I can sit on a beach in Barbados for 6 months, right, and do my emails? And obviously there's tax implications, so I think we have to be very careful about setting expectations. But there's a couple of things I just wanted to raise. One is just to your point about the measuring. We're starting to have all of those conversations with employees and say, look, you know, what do you need? What makes you happy? What makes you productive? But one of the things that we're seeing is that people have been thrown into this remote working world, but during lockdown. So there's a very false view at the moment of what remote working actually is, right? It's like the kids are at home. I can't go and get a coffee. I can't get my hair done. I can't go to the gym. So there's this very negative view about remote working, when actually remote working is a really good thing. And we're trying to, I guess, advertise all of the positive things that remote working can be when we come out of lockdown. So I just wondered whether there was any thinking around, you know, how we can sort of really socialize and give people a better view of that. And then I guess the second point is that we're trying not to associate, we're not calling it home working, we're calling it remote, because we're trying to get people thinking it's not just working at home, right? So remote working means you can work in a coffee shop, or maybe they have got a little cafe area in the gym that you can sit and check emails after the workout. But then there's this expectation that all of these retail spaces are going to have to evolve, because there's now this expectation that people are going to go in for a coffee, but they're going to take their laptop, right? And they're going to need better Wi-Fi and better spaces to sit and work. So I wondered whether there was any thinking, not just with the local co-working spaces and the change of use in the office, but actually how that affects the retail community as well, as people's expectations change.
Really nice questions. And how to remote working's been tough, right? Particularly for everyone doing homeschooling. I think on that basis, I think people will be glad to potentially carve out a new space away from home, and or find some kind of compromise or balance between the two, working from home and working in the office. I think it goes back to what I was saying about your user, your end user. I think it's going to be different. I think how you sell, I guess, remote working to your employees will really depend on their particular needs and jobs to be done. Take women, for example, stereotypically, they tend to be multitasking and juggling, any childcarer will be. So actually what their needs, that they might differ from the needs of a younger person. So it's really taking seriously those kind of, I guess, do a bit of segmentation to work out what their needs are and how remote work fits in and meets those needs specifically, in order to kind of promote it in the future. And the local spaces and adaptation, I think now's the time really to grasp the opportunity. So there is a lot of work going on around the future of the high street and potentially underutilized spaces. The public library has been in decline in terms of footfall and visitation numbers for many years now. I think museums are also in a similar situation of lack of visitors. Technology is having a massive disruptive effect on some of these physical spaces, and it's almost as if working from home will bring them alive again. What needs to be considered, though, is that work and leisure combination and F&B combination right from the outset. So in thinking new around how to reinvent the high street or redesign the high street, how does work or workplace solutions, how does it fit in? And I know many companies are now beginning to think about that and bring co-working space forward as a result of the expected need and local need.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Thanks.
Christina, your question, please. Christina, are you still with us? You're on mute?
Yes, taking myself off mute. Thank you very much, Gemma. I've very much enjoyed the conversation. I'm going back to the big scale, the macro, which is the future of cities. We're all, very much, heads or parts of real estate groups, but in essence, if we're charting the future of cities, we're a small component of that. And I see very successfully something like King's Cross that has this dynamic ecosystem of multiple things working for it. So I see this endeavor, we're all trying to figure it out ourselves, but it feels like we should be looking a lot more externally to participate in that future city, because that's going to help with the internal equation. So it's not a question. I think it's just, to me, it feels that piece has been kind of lagging in the conversation. It's all been about what companies are doing for themselves. Yes, the culture, the productivity, the programs, but really the equation has to widen to the future of the city.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think local councils are reflecting on that and really, certainly in the UK context, thinking about the offices that are being brought forward and the now the new solutions that need to be brought forward to resolve some of the challenges you guys are facing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And I'll say one question off the chat. So a question from Linda Fogg in our New York office. In terms of creating workspaces for human happiness, do you feel those happiness factors vary generationally, Gemma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think happiness is difficult to unpack. But I think generationally, as stereotypically younger generations, as I've mentioned and the survey revealed, are much more interested in ethical consumption, purpose-led, purpose-driven organisation. So their happiness will be aligned with the kind of organisational kind of brand they happen to be thinking about consuming or working with or aligning themselves with. So for them, happiness will look different to individuals who are of different ages and that gender difference I mentioned as well. So yeah, it's important to think about happiness and around the dimensions of happiness with regard to belonging, identity and respect and what that means to different people.
Thanks, Gemma. A few more minutes left before we close. Any final questions from the floor? Let me ask one final question, perhaps, Gemma. Just technology. You've mentioned technology very briefly a couple of times, but just other than the obvious Teams, Zoom, etc., what sort of role do you think technology will play in kind of creating this new way of working, this new workspace, linked to happiness and productivity, of course?
I think it's going to be key. So I think, future workspace is now being described as a network of individuals who are connected through technology. And what that looks like is really up to us to decide. But I think technology the capacity to connect people is there. Whether people want to be connected in the way technology allows them to be connected is something that we have to think about seriously. What I mean by that is, does it suit individuals? Does it meet happiness needs? Does it lead to productivity? There's discussion around some of the leading edge companies, as I said, around VR and how to almost provide a kind of a home situation that allows people to connect with an office or a workplace through VR. Some of the feedback we're hearing on that is that people want the separation. They don't want to kind of have that intrinsic connection in a home environment to work. They actually want to be separated. They want to go to work, whether that's a near me or a co-located space or an office.
Okay.
So I think we have to think carefully about that technology and how it gets resolved as a solution to the future of the workplace.
Gemma, thank you. And perhaps we'll just try and summarise very briefly. I think some points that stood out for me in the discussion. So really, first that whole relationship between the employer and the employee, that whole recruitment, incentives, flexibility, and the trust aspect. I think secondly, that kind of link to productivity and happy people are productive people, and how do we continue to keep people happy and therefore productive as we start to change the way we think about and use that workspace. I think thirdly is just that technology point and kind of exactly what role clearly has a big role to play, but what role does technology have to play? Fourthly, I think the whole purposeful thing is quite very strong as well. It's part of that thing we've talked about for years, but I think it's really accelerated through this kind of pandemic phase, really, and kind of the importance of purposeful companies, purposeful countries, the geopolitical level, purposeful individuals and what they're seeking in an employer and how they kind of work in that workspace. But I guess the final point that draws it all together is just one of change. We can no longer go back and revert to the way we did it before. We're in that change process now, but I think the change ahead to me looks very exciting, challenging as real estate professionals, but very challenging as well. And we'll see a very different model emerging over these coming years ahead. So, Gemma, on behalf of all, thanks for your time, and thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.